Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. I am honored to share some time with Professor David Schindler. Dr. Schindler's work is concerned above all with shedding light on contemporary cultural challenges and philosophical questions by drawing on the resources of the classical Christian tradition. Dr. Schindler studied the great books as an undergraduate at Notre Dame, received a master's degree in theology at John Paul II Institute, and then completed his education with a master's degree and PhD in philosophy at the Catholic University of America. After teaching 12 years at Villanova University, first as a teaching fellow in philosophy and then as a founding member of the humanities department, Dr. Schindler returned to Washington, D.C. to teach philosophy courses at the Institute. He's published more than a dozen books, including 2 volumes of a planned trilogy on the nature of freedom with the University of Notre Dame Press, and more than 70 articles, book chapters, and his work has been translated into 6 languages. I could go on and on and on, but Dr. Schindler, just a treasure to get to share some time with you. So thank you for making time for us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be on your program. I think the work that you're doing is important, and I'm really honored to be able to make a little contribution as much as I can.
Well, you've made a massive contribution. We're going to get into it, but I was introduced to your work through the book that I want to talk about today, Freedom from Reality, the Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty. So I don't know if that was the best first book to be introduced to, or you would have thrown me another one, but that's the one that I got. So I ended up encountering your work in Freedom from Reality, and I was trying to find the right word. And what I felt was like stunned. When I encountered the first few pages, I was put back on my heels in a good way, just realizing the mountain of a project that you had undertaken to put together something so powerful and so clear and so methodical, to get, you had said, to dig to the foundation of metaphysics, but really to get to the bottom of reality and to present something so succinctly but powerfully. And I set it down and I thought, okay, this is going to be a different climb. Like when you're climbing a mountain, we're going to have to take a different tack. So, uh, maybe to set some context for everybody who's listening, start out, the cover was really interesting to me. Maybe to give us the 100,000 foot view of the book, just to kind of unpack the cover and then give us that big high level glimpse of this book and why you wrote it in this moment.
Thank you. That's great. I love that you start with the cover. Um, the cover was the idea of the publishers. That they had a really great team at Notre Dame. Had asked me for some ideas, and they had some um, fairly conventional ideas initially to propose, and I suggested. I mean, I was in a little bit of a mischievous mood, and I suggested a portrait of John Locke with like a handwritten evil mustache, and that's what I proposed, and they said, okay, now we get it. So you'd like to do something a little more creative, and they proposed this. Now, what was the idea behind it? I mean, the basic idea is that John Locke is obviously a major figure in Western thought and hugely important for the founders of America. And I don't talk about the founding of America in this book, but it seems to me, because of his importance in our country, he was worth investigating himself. And behind what prompted the desire to look into his work as a starting point. The book's not simply about John Locke, but it takes him as a starting point. What prompted that was this increasing sense that I had. I think a lot of people have, that um, there are few ideas that are more central to life as we know it in the contemporary world than the idea of freedom, especially in America. I mean, freedom is something that the left and the right, I mean, everybody agrees on as one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, depending on how you look at it. But if it's something that everybody agrees is important, there are obviously many different interpretations of what it means. And it became clear to me that the way you interpret freedom just impacts almost everything else you think about. I mean, I think you can make an argument for it's affecting absolutely everything you think about. So it seemed really fundamental. And John Locke seemed to me to represent the essence of the contemporary, the origin, the roots of the contemporary view. And what I discovered in thinking about him is that there's this kind of two-faced character that on the one hand, he appeals to scripture, he appeals to reason and common sense. He makes these very clearly sound judgments about what the way we ought to think and what we ought to do and the way we ought to organize society. But if you dig below the surface, you begin to realize there's something much different going on underneath than on the surface. That in fact he was proposing a radical change from the tradition that had existed up to his time. Now, I leave open the question whether he did it consciously or that this was just something that happens through him, because I don't think it's so important whether it was deliberate on his part. I'm not trying to blame him for anything. It has become clear and ever clearer even since writing the book that he presents a view of things that is on the surface attractive, in the depths really dangerous. And I use the word diabolical. I presume we're going to talk about that at some point. That can be easily misunderstood, but I don't want to keep going on here. So I'll follow your lead with your questions.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It was playful. Like I loved the cover. So they hit it right on the head because as soon as I thought it or saw it, I thought, okay, this is a different the tone of this book is going to be really fun. And as I got into I loved your approach that you didn't kind of scapegoat or point a finger or say, somebody is the evil character in this, but you did
Right.
say it's important for us to understand that there's a headwater of that is upstream from what we experience as reality as Americans. That's why I think if you're listening to this, I will tell you this book is a heavyweight book. It's not something that you're just going to pick up and light summer reading, but I think it's the most important book. I'm going to come out and say it. The most important book for us to be reading in American context right now, deeply important to understand, but not super simple on the surface. So that's why I'm super grateful for you. You take and kind of help us. You start with Locke and spend quite a
Yeah.
bit of time with Locke, helping us understand his line of thinking and what he may have been up to, but wittingly and unwittingly, you describe that, but then you compare that Spinoza and Kant. You kind of take these three towering figures and say they all help us. They all have some things in common and some distinctives, but they present what you would say is a modern conception of freedom. And that they share some similarities in their thinking and of what we now have as a modern conception of freedom. First, what is that modern conception of freedom? When the average American says, "Well, I have free choice."
Mm-hmm.
What do we think we're saying, or what are we saying in an American context in 2024 when we say, "Well, it's my choice. I'm free, and even I have free will to make that choice."
That's right. That's right. I mean, this is going to take. I mean, this is going to take some time to think about, because I think for your listeners too, because in a way, what we're going to be talking about here is something that is so basic and so generally assumed that to raise a question about it just initially won't make much sense at all. It's not, and not because the ideas are unusual, but the it's just very different from what we normally think. I mean, just in a very basic nutshell, we all think that freedom is essentially the power to choose. So the ability to make a decision between options. We have many possible alternatives, and there's nothing that constrains us. There's nothing that forces us to choose one thing or another. Now, that seems about as straightforward as you can get. And then people will say, well, the argument is not really ever about freedom. It's just about what we use our freedom for. So people will say, we all agree about freedom being the power to choose, but I think, we should be allowed to choose X, Y, Z, and we should not be allowed to choose A, B, C. You think that you would set the limits in some other place, and we disagree where the limits should be set, but we all agree about the nature of freedom. And it seems to me that's precisely what I was trying to argue in this book, is that as obvious as that seems, that freedom is the power to choose, it was actually a novelty um, in the tradition. Not that the tradition didn't recognize the power to choose, but the older tradition, the older classical tradition and classical Christian tradition, recognized that the power to choose was just one aspect of a much more fundamental reality. And when you see it, when you come back to that fundamental reality, it changes the way you think about what choice is. All these other things sort of take care of themselves once you root things back in the basic reality. So arguably what has happened is we've removed this one aspect from its totality, and we've made that the ideal. We've isolated this one aspect and made everything turn around it. And my argument is that that's really where things begin to unravel. It's not that it's false. It's just that it's a part of a whole that becomes distorted when you separate it from the whole, if you want to put it in simple terms. That's the classical meaning of heresy, by the way. From the Christian tradition, a heresy is not a falsehood. It's a truth that's been selected out of a part of one thing that's true that's been removed from the context, and then it becomes distorted. So you might say that this notion of freedom is simply the power to choose is a heretical concept of freedom with respect to the tradition. Now we can talk about why and some implications if you like, but I'll pause there for a moment.
Yeah, I think the most helpful thing is for me to just stay out of the way and let you help us recover this because it's so good. But what you described there, this is what I mean when I say that I think it's the most important book we can be reading right now. Because as you said, and I agree, I think if this is set right, it's almost chiropractic in a way. If this move is made, then so many things downstream sort themselves out. But if we don't have this conversation and get clarity and kind of recover something here, we're just going to wrestle in circles about all of these things downstream. And there's just going to be contested, conflicted space. So maybe help us, because we are going to need some time to kind of reimagine this, because it is the default assumption right now and it's almost in evangelical circles, like an essential to what it is to be made in the image of God, that I'm there, and I'm not saying this is correct, but our feeling is that, well, that's what we've been given as creatures made in the image of God, is that here I am, and I have the ability to think and to act and to feel and to make this choice. And that's a God-given agency. And I think, yes, and right, that has to be nested within a relational context. Maybe help us contrast that more classical vision, because I think what the modern perspective, at least drawing from your work, is making such a beautiful case is the assumption that we all pretty much operate with is I'm at the center with the power to choose. And when I choose, I'm making a choice for the good. So my choice determines if something is good or not good.
That's right.
And there's a move that's contrasting to that that's deeply important. So maybe help contrast that classical position with that modern conception of freedom.
Good. Yeah. Well, let me actually begin by just making a couple of things maybe a little more concrete. I hope that they're more concrete. And that'll set some of the why some of this is important, I think, maybe in relief. So the consequences, if you think about simply the capacity to make choices as what defines freedom, one of the very obvious immediate implications of that is that anything that I am bound to is a constraint. It limits my freedom. It becomes a kind of a threat to my freedom. So, for instance, if I'm obligated to follow the law, that reduces my freedom. If I get married, that reduces my freedom. If I and those people might say, well, that's fine, but we need to reduce our freedom. And I think that's not an adequate response. We actually need to understand the nature of freedom more profoundly, because otherwise we're always going to have this division in our heart between the freedom that we desire and then these constraints that are being put on us by our every single relationship we have cuts down on our choices. And then by contrast, we think to be free, we need to multiply choices. The more options that we have, the more free we are. And you end up getting a world that is just meaningless, that there are no attachments, there are no bonds. Um, Nothing can really be compelling. Everything has to be arbitrary. You see, you start to create this world that is totally uprooted.
Mm.
And so it seems to me that while choice is always going to be part of freedom in a certain sense, it has to be rooted in a deeper sense of what the human will is and what human nature is and what it means to be in the nature of God. The Jesus, I mean, just to put it in a theological context, the Son of God, we want to say is free, right? I mean, obviously, as God, he has to be perfectly free. But if you think about it, his freedom is not doesn't consist in his capacity to reject the Father,
Mm.
right? And that if we say that, well, you have to be able to have options. He could have followed the Father or followed Satan or followed anything, and that's what makes him free. That would be a complete misunderstanding of. It would be blasphemous, but it would be a profound misunderstanding of Christ. We recognize that it's precisely in his profound obedience to the Father that he is perfectly free.
Mm.
And that shows us that in fact, being attached to things that guide us, that direct us, that dispose us in one direction or another, those aren't in principle threats to our freedom. They're only a threat to our freedom when they're bad for us, when they contradict our nature. But when they help our nature grow and flourish, they're actually a precondition for freedom rather than a threat to it. So it would be like imagine a plant that is rooted in the ground, thinking, okay, if only I could get my roots out of this ground, then I could be free.
Mm.
I mean, that's obviously, it's precisely the more deeply and fully it's rooted in the good earth that it flourishes, that it grows forth, that it has a kind of a much more profound, freedom. I'm using the term analogously here, but something similar would be for human beings. The more fully rooted we are and unreservedly attached to the fundamental things that are good for us, God, relationships with others, the world, the creation, the community that we participate in, the more fully we attach ourselves to those things, the more free we become, and the more interesting and substantial and real and joyful our choices become. So yeah, I mean, this is a very long way of saying, what freedom really is participating in the good,
Mm.
and ultimately participating in God, in a way that strengthens our capacity to find to find good, you might say, in creative ways and sort of novel ways.
Yeah. This is so helpful to hear you kind of walk back through that. Because again, there's that trigger in us that feels threatened. I know for in our listening audience, we're suspicious if somebody says that any limit, any constraint to me being able to be free to make a decision is
Yeah,
bad. Like that,
yeah,
that is saturated so deeply into our cultural context that I think anybody, I'm a Gen X person, but certainly anybody below me is going to just react immediately with like a histamine
yeah,
reaction to anything that says there's an authority, there's a line, there's something I'm bound to. Our immediate reaction is, hold on, not so fast, right?
yeah.
Um,
Right, right. And and there's reasons for that, and that's not it's a sign that we desire freedom, and it's also a sign of the many disorders in the culture that we live in that do present threats to freedom. But here's, if I may, there was an image that struck me at some point in my thinking about this that changed everything for me, and maybe it would be helpful to you and your listeners. So one way to define freedom from the classical perspective is to say that freedom is the ability to do good.
mm,
Okay. Now that seems limited. That seems like you want to say, well, it's the capacity to choose good or evil, and that's not at all. That's contrary to the classical tradition. So that would be the modern tradition: is freedom is the capacity to choose good or evil. The classical tradition is the capacity to do good. Now, what's interesting about this, there's a great book by the philosopher Etienne Gilson, the historian, about Saint Augustine, and he had this very subtle formulation that is really, I think, captures the point nicely, and it's worth reflecting on. He said that according to Augustine, um, because we are free, we have the possibility of doing evil. But insofar as we sin, insofar as we do evil, that is not an expression of our freedom.
mm, mm,
Okay, so what does he mean by that? Here's the image that finally hit me. Um, let's say that let's take the as an example, as a kind of an analogy, the capacity to walk. I can walk. Um, move myself on my two legs from here to there, right? I can transport myself. Now, it's because I have this capacity to walk that I can trip and fall. So that's one of a worm can't trip,
mm,
a worm can't fall. Okay. But it would be a complete misunderstanding if I described my power to walk as the power to either walk or trip.
mm, mm,
If I trip, it's a failure of my power to,
mm,
but my power to walk is like, so freedom is the ability to do good. Because I have that ability, I have the ability, it's possible for me to fail, to sin.
mm,
But when I sin, that's not an expression of my freedom, it's a consequence of my having freedom. But freedom is doing what's good. And here's the thing, this is why, if you can think of it in this way, the better the more you have the capacity to walk. Imagine this is, according to the classical tradition, what heaven is, that people can't sin anymore in heaven. And it's not because their freedom is limited. It's because they are so perfectly strengthened in this capacity that there's no obstacle to it. There's nothing that will cause them to trip. But if you think about it with the analogy of walking, that doesn't mean they're constrained about where they can go. Now they can go anywhere.
mm,
They can move about so perfectly freely because there's nothing that hampers their capacity to walk. And I would say freedom is like that. It is to do anything, but it's anything in this deeper sense, anything that's genuinely good, anything that brings me true joy, cosmos, my responsibilities to other people, and that kind of thing.
mm. That's so helpful. If you're listening, go back and just listen to that, because I think, again, our default assumption is freedom is my power to choose to do good or evil. And that's just,
Yeah.
if we're honest, we would say, yeah,
Yeah.
of course. And I'm a good person, or I'm a faithful person, or what, so I'm going to choose the good. But this other way of imagining reality actually widens out a possibility to grow in the capacity to choose good and to
Yeah.
see our tripping as something else. And I think this was helpful. And I want to turn you towards your unpacking of Plato's allegory of the cave, because I thought this was super helpful as well. You went into the cave and talked about that, like the reality of slavery. The creatures in Plato's cave were actually separated from something that was reality that they were to participate in. Unpack that, because I thought that was super helpful, how you brought everything down to this point and really imagined the garden. If you were thinking about good and the constraint that's put around it, you have liberty, you have freedom to do all these things, but this one thing, there's a limit. And you talk about exile and
Yeah.
separation from the good. And I thought this was so masterful. You said separate, if we can think about separation from the good at the furthest point, right?
Mhm.
That would be, you know, depicted in Plato's allegory of the cave, the lowest portion, I think you said, of the cave. What were you
Right.
pointing at in that, in taking us to that
Sure.
imagination?
Yeah, no, thank you for these great questions. Um, I'm going to bring here in the word the diabolical, because that could be misunderstood, but I think it was a crucial word in this book. That this was another discovery. I learned this through this great philosopher Ferdinand Ulrich. It was just an offhand comment that he made, but he pointed to the diabolical is the opposite of the symbolic of symbol. And I thought, wait a minute, I never thought about that. And of course, looked into the Greek etymology and realized that they're perfect opposites. Symbol actually means joining together. The creed was the first symbol of the faith, and it brought people together in saying it. And it seems to me that if we think of freedom as the ability to do the good, so a participation in goodness, our freedom joins us to other people. The more we connected we are with others and with reality, the freer we are, and the freer we are, the more we desire to be connected to things. So it enhances and strengthens our connections. The etymology of diabolical is that which sets at odds. It separates instead of joining together. It creates obstacles and oppositions. And it's easy to see how this fits for in scripture, the role of Satan, the devil, is precisely to draw a division between man and God and so forth. If freedom is the power to choose without constraints, this modern conception, my argument in the book is that it has the very logic of it is to set us apart from things, and in fact, um, uh, to the extent that things intrude on us with their demands, their reality, their compellingness, they're a threat to our freedom. So the more we seek freedom, the more we have to, in a way, neutralize things and protect ourselves from them and separate ourselves from them. So, for instance, truth, that's something by its very nature we don't control. We don't, if it's true, it's true. And we consent to it, and we can recognize it, but we can't. It's not something that we manipulate for our own purposes. We have to conform to it. Now, if that's the case, then for the modern perspective, truth by its very nature is a threat to freedom. So we need to somehow protect ourselves from the claims of truth, protect ourselves from the claims of reality, to the extent that reality presents itself to us. It makes a claim on us. It sort of requires us to respond in a certain way. And from a classical perspective, that enhances our freedom if it's done properly in the good and in relation to God. From a modern perspective, it's a threat. And so we constantly create these sort of contrivances to neutralize the claim that reality makes on us. We separate ourselves further and further. I mean, you think about, we try to turn all of reality into virtual reality. And then we're perfectly free because nothing is claiming us, nothing is impeding us, you see. And that is what Plato, he didn't quite have this language, but that's basically what hell is for Plato. It's a place of pure deception, pure separation from reality and from goodness and truth and beauty. And think about that. If that's right, a culture that is devoted to modern freedom, so freedom in the modern sense, will be an enemy in its heart and its foundations, will be an enemy to truth, goodness, and beauty. You see, we'll have to make these purely subjective opinions that are trivial. They're purely private beliefs. They don't really have any meaning for anybody outside of your own mind, outside of your virtual space. And it seems to me that there are a lot of signs that that's what we're living in, and that's the kind of civilization that we have been fostering for the past, however far you want to go back. There are debates about that, but certainly it characterizes the contemporary world, I think.
Mm. It's so it's diabolical, to, you feel that sense of separation from the actual. And that's why, again, most important book that we could be reading right now, because we're culpable, I think. Yes, we are for sure caught up in a rip current that's pulling us further and further out into a
Yes.
participation with a formation of a world that's virtual and actual, and we see the good of that, and we see all the possibility of that, and so we're kind of running fast in that direction, not paying attention to this subtler shift that's taking place, that when you disconnect from the actual, the, to create a world that is, there are no constraints. We can make whatever we want to be true. And that is the highest good, that the freedom to create unfettered is the highest good. There's a diabolical nature to that you're going to get what you get. And you talk about
Yeah,
Darwin and
that's
his,
right.
yeah, you talk about Darwin's theory as an acid. And
Mm-hmm.
I had to put the book down when you called that out, because
Mm-hmm.
it made me sad to think about the world that we are now. We talk about it in terms of a disenchanted world. It's just that acid has had its effect. And this
Right.
same thing is happening with the nature of freedom, that it's eroding or eating away at this true sense of freedom. Help us
That's right.
understand that potential versus actual piece is really important, but it's complicated. And I almost was going to have
Yeah.
you go to page 147 and just kind of unpack some of this and like get to it. But instead, I'll just say, help us understand that idea of potentiality and actuality, and why that's important, again, with this backdrop of a virtual and an actual world, and the link with freedom.
Yeah, maybe one way to think about that, because those are technical metaphysical terms, which I think are, excuse me, really helpful to unpack all this. But they are technical terms, and to get the full sense of it would require, some background work in Aristotle and scholastic metaphysics and so forth. But what it boils down to in terms of the conversation that we're having right here is, actuality is basically another word for reality. What is actually given, actually real, but it highlights the connection between, that reality is good. There's a kind of perfection to it. Uh, uh, um, one of the translations of the Latin word behind, and ultimately the Greek word behind actuality is fulfillment and fullness. So actuality has to do with the completion and fullness of things, but it has to do with the reality that's given in the world that we're in. And then potency, that is a word that's actually undergone a transformation. In the classical tradition, again, keep talking about the classical versus the modern, but it's a easy characterization here. In the classical world, possibility was always rooted in actuality. And so, what did that mean? That meant that, for example, to say that I can play the piano, that I have the possibility, the potential, the potency to play the piano, that is something that arises from the actuality of my having trained and acquired a certain disposition and spent time with real piano actually playing. And so you see that the possibility that I have grows out of a reality, the reality of the discipline of practicing, the reality of my human nature, my God-given talents, my the way my hands work, all these things. It's a fruit of what's really real about me. As opposed to the modern understanding separates potency from act and tends to think of potency or possibility in purely logical abstract terms. So to say that I can play the piano means that there's nothing that's preventing me from hitting the note. There's nothing and that's obviously a very different sense of what potency is. And if you remove potency from actuality altogether, it becomes empty and meaningless. It's just pure possibility without any direction, without any purpose, without any anchoring, without any context. It's the pure potency of somebody floating in outer space that has no limits, nothing. And you can say that person can do whatever he wants, but in a certain sense, none of it means anything, and any movement is just the same as any other movement. It becomes this kind of empty. It's very different from being able to act in a given context with given abilities that has a context that makes all of that purposeful and meaningful. So that would be potency and actuality. And I want to actually also connect this to the point that you made, or the word that you used about an enchanted universe. This really gets at something basic. One of the ways to talk about the priority of actuality is to talk about an enchanted cosmos. That things have a meaning. They're filled with meaning, and their meaning is both what they themselves are in themselves, but it's also pointing to their divine source that in a way radiates through them. This is a cosmos that we most deeply live in by responding to, by conforming ourselves to. We enter into it, we receive it for what it is, and we respond and are elevated up into it through our proper relationships and so forth. One of the you might say one of the strategies for changing our conception of freedom is one of the first things that had to be done was to eliminate, was to disenchant the cosmos. Now it's no longer imposing itself on me. Now it's stuff that I can control. And so disenchanting the cosmos becomes a way of making it safe for modern liberty. And and here's the thing that's so strange about this is, and this is why it's diabolical, why I really like that word, because it carries with it a sense of deception. That in fact, when we transform all of reality into virtual reality, in one respect, we feel like we have total control over everything. But in fact, we have changed ourselves into just mere cogs in a bigger system, a bigger machine. We have absolutely no real control. We are pure passive subjects of coercive powers and manipulating forces and so forth. So diabolical freedom is not real freedom. It's the feeling that you are free.
Mm,
Um, the and the sort of coaxing us into accepting that feeling as good enough.
mm,
I don't really have to be free. I just need to feel that I'm free. And you see the implications of that. That really just makes us sitting ducks for all sorts of malignant forces, as it were.
mm. Yeah, I don't think there's anything more heartbreaking than imagining the slaves captive in Plato's allegory of the cave, rewarded with a system of merits and rewards, entertained, feeling as though
Yeah,
they are free to participate in something that's a non-reality, and even
that's right.
even rewarded, and constructing a system of culture within the cave that
Mhm.
is feels like we are in control and feels like we are free. And this is what I think so piercing about Jesus's invitation when you were talking about fullness, that and
Mhm.
fullness as reality. Like, I came that you might have life and have it to the full, like to participate in the actual thing,
That's right.
and by
That's right.
participating in the actual, to reach your potential, to be who you were made to be. But that is, you will never, you'll never recover that if you don't enter into the actual, which is a relational context, not a separated diabolical, right? You see
Yeah.
it just boom. This is again why I say most important book that we could be reading in our moment, because you get to the bedrock of this. And for everybody who's listening, I know that this is probably even this is going to be work to go back and listen to this conversation, but please do it, and order the book, and maybe just, or let's have conversations or spark one off at your church, or with a group of friends, because to try to help recover this first move, what we said at the beginning, if this one is seen rightly,
Mhm.
so much sorts out downstream. Um,
That's right.
but if
That's
we
right. It changes our sense of family, our sense of our relationship to God, most fundamentally, our relationship to ourselves, to our body, to our family, to our neighborhood, to our political, or I mean, everything just changes.
Yeah.
It really is, they're details, but it's sort of one or the other. It's either we begin with reality as good, true, and beautiful and beckoning to us to respect it and enter into it, or it's mere raw material stuff at our disposal.
Yeah.
And that's the basic choice. And the character of life changes dramatically in the two cases.
Yeah. It's so good. We could spend literally a year just working our way slowly through it. We never got to page 147. If you order the book, right at 147, at the bottom of 147, like it all settles in, and we make a turn and we start to kind of move forward. So before we get out of here, for all of us who are raising kids, participating in churches, trying to just get through the day to day, but we're feeling that that meaningful backdrop has been erased. The world's particularized, so there's no whole, all part, all those things that we feel very disenchanted. And you hear a conversation like this and you go, this is so massive, I don't even know where to begin.
Mm.
How at our dinner table can we begin to recover a way of imagining freedom as bound to good? And maybe you could help me with my language, but I see, like, what you've set is we receive something. Reality is there. God exists, and He is ultimate beauty, good, true. And our existence is derived from that ultimate being. And so then our design is actually aimed at our good is to flourish in this image bearing capacity of beauty, goodness, and truth. And so we're kind of bookended by the source and origin of our being, and the aim and what it is to be human. And those are great bookends. But at a dinner table, how do we help recover that way of imagining reality? What are some ways that you think are just essential to start to help imagine a more enchanted world rather than a disenchanted world where everything is just material meant for us to manipulate or be manipulated by?
There would be a million things to say, but I mean, just to begin with where you began, actually having a dinner table is the beginning of a response. And that seems like a strange thing to say, but we picture virtual, everybody's eating with their headphones on in their own rooms. That's diabolical freedom. Eating at the dinner table, we all are sharing one meal, so that's putting constraints in what we're eating. But think about how in the food that we're eating, we're connecting, we're not just feeding ourselves, we're connecting to other people. And we're celebrating the goodness of creation, and where we are in a way giving glory to God very naturally by having a well-cooked meal that's well served in a family that is talking to each other. That is the beginning of freedom right there. And things like reading stories, listening to stories together, even cultivating the imagination through these things of beauty and these experiences that then we can talk about together in family life. Family life is really crucially important in all of this. I think that's a great place to start, and that's where the big ball starts rolling, and if it picks up momentum, it moves out into the culture more generally.
Yeah, I love it. Dr. Schindler, thank you. Here's what I'm going to propose. I'm going to keep working. I'm going to go at least a couple passes through Freedom from Reality, the diabolical character of modern liberty. So I'm going to keep working through this. You're going to hear us reference back to Dr. Schindler's book over and over as we keep pursuing this work to uncover an enchanted reality, to do it with beauty and goodness and truth, and to even try to imagine what those words mean and to recover what's been lost. So, Dr. Schindler, thank you for the incredible gift you've given to us, the treasure of this time. We appreciate it. And maybe we'll ask you if I get lost, can I ping you back? Because I'm out of my depth swimming in some of these. So,
I'd be very happy. This was really a great delight, and I thank you. And again, thanks for your work that you're doing.
yeah,
And yeah, and good luck to you and all of your listeners.
thank you.